There are places in the world that people avoid for obvious reasons. Burned houses, collapsed buildings, ruins left behind by disasters. But sometimes there are places that people avoid for reasons no one openly explains. Places where nothing dramatic seems to have happened. No murders recorded. No ghosts reported. No tragedies written in official history. And yet the people who live nearby still refuse to walk too close. Ashcraft Manor was one of those places. The house stood alone on a quiet stretch of land near Hartwell County in Vermont, surrounded by tall trees that had grown old enough to hide most of its stone walls from the road. From a distance, it looked less like a home and more like a memory that had been forgotten by time. The windows were empty. The roof sagged slightly under decades of weather, and the iron gate that once protected the property hung crookedly on its hinges. For generations, the people of Hartwell passed the house without stopping. When outsiders asked about it, locals usually responded with short answers. It's just an old property. No one's lived there in years. Nothing interesting ever happened there. But those same people rarely explained why the house had been abandoned in the first place. They didn't describe it as haunted. They didn't call it cursed. Instead, they used a quieter phrase. They said the house remembered things people had chosen to forget. For more than a century, Ashcraft Manor remained untouched. Ownership changed on paper several times, but no one truly attempted to restore it. Rooms remained locked, corridors stayed closed, and certain sections of the house were simply ignored. Eventually, the property became little more than a historical artifact, an aging structure waiting for someone to decide whether it should be preserved or demolished. That decision finally came in the autumn of 2023. A regional historical preservation trust purchased the property with the intention of restoring it. The paperwork described the manor in simple architectural terms. A private stone residence constructed in the late 1850s. Structurally unstable in certain areas, but still recoverable. The documents mentioned damaged staircases, weakened support beams, and sections of the roof that required reinforcement. But there was something unusual hidden inside the records. Among dozens of names connected to the property, owners, caretakers, laborers, servants, visiting relatives, there was one detail that stood out. None of the documents mention a child. Not once. This might not sound unusual at first, but during the late 19th century, houses the size of Ashcraft Manor almost always contained families. Large households, multiple generations, children who inherited the property or grew up within its walls. Yet according to every surviving record, Ashcraft Manor had never housed a single child, at least not officially. The restoration project began quietly. Workers arrived with equipment, blueprints, and structural plans. Their job was simple: stabilize the building, remove damaged interior sections, rebuild areas that had collapsed. For the first few days, the work proceeded exactly as expected. Rotting wood was removed. Broken railings were replaced. Old paneling was stripped away to expose the original structure beneath. But during the first week of renovations, something unexpected appeared. A crew working along the western corridor noticed a section of decorative wooden wall paneling that sounded different when tapped. Instead of the solid echo of stone behind it, the sound was hollow. At first they assumed the wall simply concealed unused space. A ventilation shaft perhaps, or a chimney that had been sealed long ago. But when the paneling was carefully removed, the workers discovered something that didn't match any of the building's original architectural plans. Behind the wall was a narrow wooden door, and the door had been locked from the outside. The lock itself was old, heavily corroded, but still intact, which meant the door had not been opened for a very long time. When the mechanism was finally forced open, the door creaked inward slowly. The air that escaped from the room beyond carried a smell that only exists in spaces untouched by time. Dust, rotting wood, and something else, something colder. The room behind the door was small, much smaller than the surrounding corridors of the manor. It had no windows, no decorations, no furniture except for what remained of a simple wooden bed frame that had collapsed under its own decay. The walls were bare plaster, but they were not empty. Across the surface of the walls were hundreds of shallow scratches, thin lines carved into the plaster at different heights, some low near the floor, others higher. The marks appeared random at first glance, but when examined more closely, they revealed a pattern. They had been carved gradually, over time, like someone measuring growth. Near the center of the room, partially buried in dust, lay a small metal object, a button. Its edges had been worn smooth, and engraved in the center was a single letter, the letter E. The room contained no bones, no clothing, no written explanation, nothing that clearly revealed who had once occupied the space. But one fact was impossible to ignore. This room had not been an accident. It had been designed, built, hidden, and deliberately erased from the official structure of the house. Someone had wanted this space to remain invisible. Someone had wanted it forgotten. But the discovery of that room raised a far more unsettling question. If the room had existed for more than a century, who had lived inside it? And why had their existence been removed from history? To answer that question, historians had to go back in time. Back to the years when Ashcraft Manor was still new. Back to the man whose name had once defined the house. Edgar Ashcraft. In the late 1800s, Hartwell County was undergoing quiet transformation. Railroads were expanding. Property disputes were becoming more common. Legal authority was gaining influence across the region. And Edgar Ashcraft had positioned himself carefully within that changing world. He was a lawyer known for his discipline and discretion. Clients trusted him with conflicts that never reached public courtrooms, land negotiations, inheritance disputes, financial settlements. He was respected not because he was loud or charismatic, but because he was precise. Edgar Ashcraft spoke rarely, but when he did, people listened. By his early 40s, his reputation had grown beyond Hartwell. Regional officials began mentioning his name in connection with political appointments and judicial advisory positions. His future appeared secure, and Ashcraft Manor stood as a physical symbol of that success. The house had originally been built by his father in the late 1850s. Its design reflected the values Edgar believed in: order, Control. Permanence. Visitors who arrived at the manor often described the same impression. The house felt stable, structured, predictable. Nothing inside it appeared accidental. Everything had been arranged deliberately. But there was one detail about Edgar Ashcroft's life that official biographies never mentioned. Before his reputation had fully formed, before his rise in legal influence, he had employed a young woman named Martha Bell. She worked as a private tutor. Martha was educated, quiet, and recently arrived in Vermont without close family connections, which made her both useful and invisible. Their professional relationship did not remain strictly professional for long. And in the spring of 1879, Martha Bell gave birth to a son. The child's name was Elliot Bell. There was no church announcement, no public record connecting the child to Edgar Ashcroft. Financial support was provided quietly. Housing was arranged discreetly, but acknowledgement never came. Edgar did not deny the child's existence. He simply refused to attach his name to it, because by that time his ambitions had grown too large. A child born outside marriage was not simply a personal mistake. It was a political threat, and Edgar Ashcroft was not willing to risk everything he had built. For several years, Martha Bell raised Ellie alone and rented housing near the outskirts of Hartwell. Edgar visited rarely, always discreetly, always at times when no one would see him. But when Martha's health began to fail, the arrangement could not continue. Elliot was still a small child, and without his mother, there was no one left to care for him. At that moment, Edgar Ashcroft faced a decision that would quietly reshape the future of Ashcraft Manor. He brought the boy into the house, but not as a son, and not as a member of the family. Elliot Bell entered Ashcraft Manor under conditions that would define the rest of his life. Conditions that would eventually lead to the construction of a room that history had almost succeeded in erasing. When Elliot Bell first arrived at Ashcraft Manor, he was too young to understand the meaning of secrecy. He was only 6 years old. To him, the house was enormous. Its hallways seemed to stretch forever, and its tall ceilings made every room feel like a place meant for giants. But very quickly, Elliot began to notice something unusual about the way he was expected to live there. He was not allowed to wander through the manor freely. There were rules, many rules. Some were spoken directly by Edgar Ashcroft himself. Others were quietly enforced by the small number of servants who worked inside the house. Elliot was told he must stay in certain parts of the manor and avoid others entirely. He was never to appear when visitors were present. If guests arrived unexpectedly, he was instructed to leave the main corridors immediately and remain hidden until the house returned to silence. At first, Elliot believed this was temporary. Perhaps he was simply waiting for the right time to be introduced properly. Perhaps one day Edgar Ashcroft would acknowledge him openly. But that day never came. Instead, the boundaries around Elliot's life slowly became smaller. Most of his days were spent in a series of back rooms on the western side of the manor, areas rarely used by the rest of the household. A small study, a narrow hallway, and a bedroom that had originally been intended for storage. This was where Elliot lived. The servants who occasionally brought him food treated him politely but cautiously. They rarely spoke more than necessary, and none of them stayed long enough for conversation. Even as a child, Elliot could sense that his presence inside the manor was something everyone preferred not to discuss. The one person who did speak with him regularly was Edgar Ashcraft himself. But those conversations were never warm. They were instructional. Edgar approached Elliot the way a teacher might approach a student whose behavior required strict correction. He explained that Elliot must understand the importance of discretion. Certain things in life needed to remain quiet, invisible, hidden. You must learn patience, Edgar once told him during one of their brief meetings. The world does not need to know every detail about every life. Elliot listened carefully. He wanted approval. Like most children, he wanted the attention of the man who had brought him into the house. But approval from Edgar Ashcraft was difficult to earn. Years passed, and Elliot grew older. His world remained small. Most of his education came from books that Edgar allowed him to read in the small study. History, geography, mathematics. The boy learned quickly. In fact, he learned so quickly that Edgar began to recognize something he had not expected. Elliot was intelligent, exceptionally intelligent. He absorbed information with remarkable speed, often finishing entire books within days. Sometimes he even began writing small essays of his own, copying the formal tone he had observed in Edgar's legal documents. But intelligence did not change Elliot's position in the house. If anything, it complicated it, because as Elliot grew older, he began asking questions. Questions about his mother. Questions about the town he could occasionally see through distant windows. Questions about why he was never allowed to walk outside the gates of the manor. Edgar Ashcraft never answered these questions directly. Instead, he repeated the same message. The world is complicated. Some situations require patience. One day you will understand. But Elliot was beginning to understand something else. He understood that the rest of the world existed without him. Occasionally, he heard voices echoing through the distant halls of the manor. Visitors, friends, business associates. He heard laughter, dinner conversations, music from a piano played somewhere beyond the walls that surrounded his life. But Elliot was never part of those moments. He existed beside them, not within them. Then, when Elliot was 10 years old, something happened that quietly changed everything inside Ashcraft Manor. Edgar Ashcraft announced his engagement. He was going to marry. The woman's name was Eleanor Whitcomb. She came from a respected family in Boston and carried with her the kind of social reputation that Edgar's political ambitions required. The marriage promised stability, influence, and a future that would eventually include children who could inherit the Ashcraft name without scandal. Which meant one thing was suddenly very clear. Elliot Bell could not exist within that future. At first, Edgar considered sending the boy away entirely. A boarding school, a distant relative, an arrangement somewhere far enough away that Elliot would never appear in Hartwell again. But there was a problem. Elliot had already spent years inside the manor. Servants had seen him. Documents existed that could potentially connect him to Edgar's past. Removing the boy, too, suddenly might raise questions. And questions were dangerous. So Edgar Ashcraft made a different decision. Instead of removing Elliot from the house, he decided to remove him from the world. Construction inside the manor began quietly during the spring of 1889. Officially, the workers were hired to repair aging sections of the western corridor. But part of their work involved building something new, a narrow room hidden within the walls of the manor itself. The design was simple. No windows, thick plaster walls, a single wooden door placed behind decorative paneling so that it blended perfectly with the surrounding corridor. From the outside, the wall would appear solid, but behind it, a small chamber would exist that no visitor would ever discover. The workers who built it assumed it was a storage space, perhaps a vault for legal documents, or a hidden archive. None of them realized its true purpose. When the construction was finished, Edgar Ashcraft brought Elliot to see the room. The boy was 11 years old. By then he had learned not to question Edgar's decisions openly. Still, when he stepped inside the chamber for the first time, confusion filled his face. The room felt smaller than the spaces he had known before. The ceiling was low. The walls were bare. There was only a simple wooden bed and a small writing table. "This will be your new room," Edgar said calmly. Elliot looked around slowly. But why? Edgar's answer was carefully measured. Because the world outside this house is changing, and certain things must remain protected. Elliot did not fully understand what those words meant, but he understood something else very clearly. The door closed behind him, and when Edgar locked it from the outside, a new chapter of Elliot Bell's life began. At first, the arrangement followed a routine. Food was delivered twice a day. Books were occasionally provided, and Edgar sometimes opened the door to speak with Elliot through the narrow gap between them. But those visits became less frequent as time passed. Edgar Ashcroft's marriage to Eleanor Whitcomb took place later that year. Guests traveled from several cities to attend the ceremony. Music filled the halls of Ashcraft Manor. Laughter echoed through rooms Elliot could no longer reach. And somewhere beyond the hidden wall of the western corridor, a celebration unfolded that would shape the future of the Ashcraft family. Inside the secret chamber, Elliot listened. He heard footsteps, voices, the distant sound of piano music drifting through the house. For the first time in his life, he realized something that had never been spoken aloud. He had not been hidden temporarily. He had been erased. Days became months. Months slowly turned into years. Elliot continued reading the books left for him. He continued writing notes in the margins of old paper. He began carving small lines into the plaster walls beside his bed, simple marks that counted the passing of time. At first the marks were organized, one line for each day, but eventually the pattern became less precise. Time inside the room did not move the same way it did outside, and the longer Elliot remained there, the more uncertain the future became. Because Ashcraft Manor was changing, a new family was growing within its walls. Edgar and Eleanor soon had children of their own, children who would grow up running through the same hallways Elliot once imagined exploring, children who would inherit the name that Elliot could never claim, and somewhere hidden behind the walls of the house, another child continued to exist, unseen, unacknowledged, and slowly forgotten.